Tonight, my name is Thomas MacArthur, and I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Family Engagement here at the College of Wooster. And we're thrilled to bring you another webinar as part of a series of professional development and personal enrichment programs that we are offering through the web. So we're glad you're here. I have the privilege to introduce to you our speaker this evening, Pamela Coburn Lipvac. Pamela is a neuroscientist, author, speaker, and certified executive coach, drawing on 25 years of research and teaching the effects of stress on mental health. Pam helps administrators and leaders manage their work stress in terms of time and priority mismanagement, communication, conflict resolutions, and leading large change initiatives. Her coaching, training, and advising programs help organizations prevent burnout and promote a culture of well-being. That is what we are all here for tonight, to learn about how we can use those tips in our own work and life. After completing her bachelor's degree in zoology and molecular biology from Andrews University, Pam earned a PhD in neurobiology and behavior from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. Go SUNY. She worked as a faculty member and administrator for many years, and her research has been published in the peer-reviewed journals Neuroscience and Neurobiology of Learning and Behavior. In addition, Pam is a certified executive coach through the International Coaching Federation and holds specialty certifications in leadership coaching. We are thrilled to welcome Pam this evening. Pam, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And sorry about the beginning stress. It's tough to try to get into Zoom calls sometimes. I've had that issue myself over the past couple of years. So thank you all for joining. I'd like to start out just with a poll, if that's all right. I think Sharon is going to be our tech producer this evening, and she might be throwing up a poll for us all to answer here. Yeah, so on a scale from 1 to 5, let's say the last few minutes notwithstanding, right? I mean, we've all kind of felt our stress levels rise as we couldn't get into the meeting appropriately, but on a stress scale from 1 to 5, let's say over the course of the last couple of weeks, 1 being, you feel really cool and calm, like a cucumber, and 5 being sometimes you feel like your hair has been on fire. What are your stress levels like right now? Are you not feeling stressed, or are you feeling very stressed? Where would you fall, you say? And once we all submit, I think Sharon is going to close up the poll so that we can all see our responses here. So Sharon, whenever you feel like we have given everyone a chance to respond, let's go ahead and close so that we can all see what those poll results are. Okay, so no one is not stressed. That's interesting. Looks like we're a little bit skewed to the stress to very, most of us are at 4 and some of us are at 5, very, very stressed. So this is not uncommon for me especially when I'm speaking on things like burnout. I usually get a crowd of people, they're like, oh yeah, sign me up. And so I get people who are on the further end of the scale. So I'm so glad that you're here if you are in that crowd, because we are here to talk solutions. So thank you all for joining today. As Thomas mentioned, I was trained as a neuroscientist, and now I work as an executive coach, and I really love to help organizations try to learn how to deal with some of the things that are causing them stress and burnout. And as I work with these organizations, I do try to address stressors that are specific to their industry and what to do about them. And one common occupational hazard for anyone who in their profession is responsible for caring for other people is compassion fatigue. And this affects multiple industries, as you can imagine. Of course, it's going to affect healthcare workers. We've seen that happen over the past couple of years, especially. But it also impacts others. It impacts counselors and therapists. It impacts correctional officers, military personnel, ministers and clergy. It affects people who work with other species on the planet other than other human beings. So it affects animal care workers and zookeepers. And of course, in this crowd, how can I not mention compassion fatigue is something that teachers and educators also struggle with. And it doesn't just affect those of us on the front lines of healthcare or care. It affects people at all levels of the organization. So as you are here and wanting to talk about burnout and perhaps compassion fatigue, I'm so glad, because this does impact people at multiple levels of all organizations. You may have heard this quote by Rachel Remen before. She wrote a book several years ago. She said, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet." She continues, the quote continues, "We burn out because not because we don't care, but because we don't grieve. We burn out because we've allowed our hearts to become so filled with loss that we have no room left to care." So we've all certainly experienced, in many ways, loss over the past couple of years, and it is perfectly normal to grieve those losses. But my hope is, in this session, we will have the opportunity to discuss together some of the ways to diffuse any symptoms of compassion fatigue. You'll see that burnout is a very large component of compassion fatigue. So we'll be talking about burnout as well. And we'll all be able to sort of refill our reserves of compassion, empathy, and enthusiasm for our work. I'd like to just throw up another very quick poll. Sharon is going to help us here. I'd like to start with a self-assessment. I'm going to give you some options that have been developed by the Mayo Clinic. These are all symptoms of the way you might be experiencing burnout right now. I think the way these polls work in Zoom is that you can only check one. So unfortunately, if you're experiencing more of these, you'll just have to choose the one that you think is impacting you the most. But are you feeling more cynical, disillusioned in your work? Are you dragging around like you just don't feel like you have enough energy? Do you feel like you have a shorter fuse than usual? Like you get angrier easier? Do you have brain fog, poor memory, poor concentration? Are you just not feeling the enthusiasm, the zest for your job that you used to? Are you having any issues of relying on food or any other sort of escapism techniques? Are you having sleep problems? What is impacting you right now? What would you say is the thing that you're experiencing most? And I'm gonna, oh, I guess we can check more than one because I just checked two. It's allowing me to do that. Anyway, Sharon, once you think everyone has had the opportunity to answer this poll, go ahead and close it up so that we can all see what kinds of symptoms we're experiencing right now. All right, so the answer is all of the above. So yeah, I think this is not, again, like I said, this is not uncommon when I'm doing a webinar like this. And if we do national polls and even international polls that have been done to check in with people what their sort of mental health is like during this very challenging time that we're living in, we're getting similar results there too. Over half of US citizens are now experiencing at least one negative mental health symptom, if not more than one. And so this, I think we are all tracking on the same line here, where we're all experiencing multiple symptoms of burnout. And again, I'm so glad that you're here to discuss what to do about this. So thank you so much. Just to give you a brief overview of where we're going to go with the rest of the session, two major things that we're going to cover. First, we're going to be reviewing some research findings about burnout and about compassion fatigue. And then in the final part of the conversation, we will be reviewing both personal and organizational strategies for how to deal with these two things. So compassion fatigue has been described in the research literature as the cost of caring for others who are in either physical or emotional pain. And we all have probably sensed this if we are in a industry where we are caring for other people. We have felt the drain on our own physical and emotional strength that happens to the point where we start feeling spent and cynical. And we have a hard time empathizing and caring for our clients, our customers, our patients, our students sometimes. And it can even get to the point where we start having trouble connecting with and empathizing and caring for people in our more personal circles, our friends and family. Compassion fatigue certainly existed prior to COVID-19, but it has been exacerbated by this pandemic. Many of the people in the professions that you see listed here have suffered greater rates of compassion fatigue over the past couple of years. I'm just going to mention one research study that I think might be pertinent to this crowd, because I noticed that among the registrants that Sharon, she didn't tell me who was coming, but she let me know what industry they were in. And I noticed that there was a high percentage who are in education. Yay. But what we have noticed over the past couple of years is educators, of course, are among the many who are suffering burnout and compassion fatigue. One research study actually compared the compassion fatigue and burnout rates between educators and healthcare workers. And not surprisingly, both were very high. But here was the kicker of this one particular study. And this study covered like thousands of people. So it was a pretty good sample size. Compassion fatigue was even higher in educators than it was in frontline healthcare workers. And when the researchers were trying to theorize why this was, their hypothesis was that healthcare workers have been generally lauded over the past couple of years and applauded by the rest of society. But educators have had a much tougher road. They've been trying to build an entire pandemic education experience on the fly, literally trying to build that plane as they were flying in it. And so, and we all know, we all have seen the stories that educators were not always applauded for the decisions that they made. So I think this was one reason. They had a lack of a support system, perhaps, and so that was one of the reasons why they felt or experienced higher rates of burnout and compassion fatigue. So if you're in that group, you're not alone. There are lots of other people in there with you. As we think from a research perspective, what underpins compassion fatigue, research tells us that there are three factors that converge to create a sense of compassion fatigue. Burnout, which is something that I know a lot of us are experiencing also, but there are two other factors too. There's secondary trauma and compassion satisfaction. Now, burnout itself means that we're suffering from, again, three sort of factors, and I call them the 3 E's. The first is a loss of energy, feeling like, oh man, I'm not even sure I can make it out of bed today. The second E is a loss of enthusiasm. So you start to wonder, why in the world am I even doing this? Why am I even here? That's also something that is very common with burnout. And the third E is loss of effectiveness. So we start to see our productivity slide downhill. We can develop burnout when we are working in very high stress and demanding work environments, especially if we feel like we have little to no control over those environments. But I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Secondary trauma means that we are traumatized by hearing or experiencing the trauma that other people are undergoing. And the symptoms of secondary trauma are very similar. They can develop very quickly, and they're very similar to what people experience with PTSD, for example. So feeling like you are afraid, you're not always sure why, but there are triggers in your environment that might trigger that sense of fear. Having intrusive thoughts about the trauma that you heard about, and trying to actively avoid those things that remind you of that traumatic event. Now, compassion fatigue will rise when both of these first factors, burnout and secondary trauma, are very high, but it will also rise if the third element is very low, compassion satisfaction. This is the pleasure that we who care for people in our professions, this is the pleasure that we take in our work. This is our jam, caring for other people. We are passionate, we invest a lot of time and energy into other people, and this is a source of joy and fulfillment for us. So 3 points that I'd like to make about these three factors right now. So the first point that I'd like to make is none of these have sort of an on-off switch to them. You know, you're not either burned out or not. You are probably somewhere on a spectrum of, you know, being stressed out up to burnout. There are assessment tools that are out there that can help us all determine where on the spectrum we lie on all three of these factors: burnout, secondary trauma, compassion, satisfaction. One very good one is called the Professional Quality of Life Scale. That is going to be included as a link. It's a free assessment tool. You can find it on the internet, but I will include it in a document that will be shared with you in a follow-up email after the session is over. The second point that I want to make is that it's really the convergence of these three factors that determines the severity of our compassion fatigue. And the third point is that, like most complex disorders like clinical anxiety, clinical depression, PTSD, compassion satisfaction is also a very complex disorder, and it can arise from different patterns of these three things playing off each other. So some people will experience compassion fatigue because they have witnessed a relatively recent event of trauma that they watch someone else go through. Another person may be feeling compassion fatigue because they have severe burnout. So it can arise from different patterns. And the question that I'd like for you all to share your thoughts on in the chat is, where are you right now? Where do you feel like you are? Where do you feel like your team members are right now? What experience do you all have with compassion fatigue and or burnout? If you'd love to share your thoughts, and I would love to see your thoughts here in chat. What are your experiences here? How many people are feeling burnt out right now? Is that really where people are right now? Because I know that's underlying compassion fatigue for a lot of us. I'm not seeing, okay, good. Thank you, Laura. Not frontline healthcare worker, hasn't been bad for me. Yes, so great. I'm glad that compassion satisfaction is something that is jazzing you right now. Okay, so people who are not burned out are sharing their thoughts in chat. Thank you for those of you who are doing that. I'm glad that there are some people that are not feeling burned out. Maybe you can share some of your tips with the rest of us. Yes, a lot of us are feeling burned out and frustrated, especially in education. Okay, and some of us are relating to the bottom image where we're both experiencing high burnout and high secondary trauma. Yep, that's one of the patterns for sure. Thank you all for joining the discussion. Now that we are, oh, okay, so somebody is an animal care worker, and yeah, burnout started prior to COVID, for sure. And I'm working with some organizations in that way. Compassion satisfaction flatlined. Yep. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I would love to try to drill a little bit deeper into what compassion fatigue and burnout feel like for us. So let's talk about the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue. Since this is a complex, multifactorial disorder, the symptoms that we experience can also be very complex, and they can hit us in a lot of different ways. They can hit us physically, they can hit us mentally, they can hit us emotionally. And because we get hit in so many different directions by burnout and compassion fatigue, we're also going to see this show up in our behaviors, the way we treat other people, and therefore it's going to also affect our relationships. So here are all the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue in those different areas. Won't go through all of these in detail, but I'd love to get your reaction to some of the things that you're seeing on here, like brain fog, poor memory, apathy over an emotions, getting a sense of numbness or helplessness, feeling irritable down in the behaviors, getting more impatient, having sleep problems, like you get insomnia, you don't usually get insomnia. What rings true here for you guys? Are you experiencing any of these things? Have you noticed some of your colleagues experiencing some of these things? Sleep issues. Yep. I'd say in the past couple years, I have experienced more sleep issues than I normally have. Muscle tension, aches and pains. Okay, more than one of us is experiencing sleep issues for sure. Appetite changes, that's definitely something that can happen. Yep. Yes. Also eating too much for sure, because we all want to go to our comfort place, whatever that is, comfort food, comfort whatever. Yeah, thank you all for joining this discussion and sharing your thoughts in the chat. I really appreciate that. It's important to bear in mind that our signs and symptoms can kind of get worse over time as well. So the signs and symptoms that you have of either burnout or compassion fatigue, and we now know that they're very much interrelated, can start out very mild, like the things that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, and then they can progress in severity as they increase in either intensity or duration. Like we just have to handle things for months on end. So then our symptoms can get worse over time until they progress to the red phase that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. So at their most dangerous, we're talking about serious physical issues that can put us at higher risk for things like heart attacks and stroke, and serious emotional distress as well. People can start experiencing symptoms of clinical anxiety, clinical depression, PTSD, and so on. And our thoughts can become so distorted near the very worst end of the spectrum that we are ultimately at higher suicide. So I won't show you the data in this presentation, but there's a lot of data out there to show that caregiver professions, healthcare professionals, and also veterinarians, which I see someone has joined us who's a veterinarian. In some of these caregiving professions, they are at higher risk for mental distress, suicidal thoughts, and suicidal behaviors compared to the general population. Now let's talk about how compassion fatigue and burnout shows up at work. This data, like the other data, the symptom data that I showed you before, this comes from Charles Figley. He is a traumatologist. He's the founder of a traumatology institute at Tulane University. And he wrote a manual on compassion fatigue, where he outlines the impact of compassion fatigue at work. And he talks about how compassion fatigue can show up in many different ways, in work performance issues, behaviors, in employee morale, of course, and also in work relationships. So again, I'd love to get your thoughts here, your reaction to this data. What impact have you seen of compassion fatigue in your workplace? Have you or your team members experienced some of these issues? Good question. Presenteeism. So absenteeism is not showing up at work at all because we have an increased amount of sick days. Either it's a mental health day or a physical health day where we just don't show up. Presenteeism is being at work but being mentally checked out. So you are at work, but you're just having a really hard time concentrating and focusing on things at work. What are you guys seeing in your workplace? Any of these issues popping up their ugly heads for you guys? Irritability, lack of communication, procrastination, yep. Harder to focus, for sure, yeah. So absenteeism and presenteeism are, of course, some of the things that are happening all over the place and something that I won't touch on in this presentation, but of course we've all heard of the Great Resignation too, right? So some people are getting so severely burned out that they're actually leaving their workplaces and going to other jobs. I guess that falls under behavioral, right? The frequent job changes thing that you see down in the bottom. Decreased quality of relationships, for sure. Lack of motivation, yeah. So thank you all again. I really appreciate you joining in this discussion here. Now that we know what burnout and compassion fatigue look like and feel like, let's talk about how they might develop in workers. So research has pointed out some underlying risk factors that increases the chances that you and I may suffer from compassion fatigue and burnout. And if we take all of that information that research has has developed over the past several decades, they really boil down to two things. There are two sources of stress that can feed into these three factors of compassion fatigue: who we are and where we work. So let's talk about these things in greater detail. We're all shaped by both biology and by life events that happen to us, right? So in other words, we're all products of both nature and nurture. If we have a history of stress and trauma, especially if we've had stressors that have happened to us in early childhood, we can be more sensitive to stress as adults. No one at work may even be aware that you and I are struggling with stress at home or in our personal relationships, but that certainly doesn't mean that we are not internalizing that stress and it is walking into the door with us when we head to our jobs. So this can create stress outside of work, can create this unstable foundation upon which our workplace stress will continue to build. Personal biology, are things like genetics and biology. This can definitely impact the way we deal with stress. And these can be a variety of different things. It can be the way stress hormones are circulating in the body or the way certain brain chemicals are being released. A lot of these factors can impact our ability to react to stress in a healthy way. We can add on to this any personality or psychological traits that can amplify our stress response. So what would be a good example of that? When I'm thinking about this, I have to go to myself and think about some of my quirks that increase my sensitivity to stress. And I'd say that one factor is definitely pessimism for me. I was a born pessimist. I'm one of those people that generally likes to walk on the dreary side of life instead of the sunshine side. I don't know why, I was just born that way. But research does show that we negative Nancys or negative Neds, we sometimes have it generally, we generally have a harder time dealing with stress than more optimistic people do. And we could add on to this coping mechanisms. So this would be anything that we do that we use as a coping mechanism that may not actually be healthy for us. One would be avoidance, sticking our head in the sand and thinking that if we ignore something, it's simply going to go away. That'd be an unhealthy coping mechanism. Escapism, and this could be escape in, yes, thank you. Some people are responding to this. Escaping into comfort foods or binge watching Netflix all weekend or relying on drugs and alcohol. Some of these things, to an excessive extent, they can be unhealthy because when we are done using those, comfort mechanisms, our stress and our anxiety is going to be right there waiting for us. So these are all sort of the personal, individual things that can happen. What would you guess are some of the top workplace stressors that can fuel our burnout or compassion fatigue? I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this. What is going to create burnout at work? Unrealistic expectations, Tina, for sure. What else? I'm going to go to a Zoom yoga class. I'm going to show up next time if you send me the link. Poor communication, impatient clients. Yes, all good thoughts. Difficult bosses or coworkers. Holding up too many people. Yeah, some of the public health challenges that we have in our country right now. Not backfilling positions, so staffing shortages for sure. Piling on of assignments, yeah, definitely. So you guys are hitting on some of these issues that research is actually pointing out as well. So excessive workload is definitely one of those things that is going to impact our burnout rates. Overwork and overwhelm it was a problem before COVID, but it certainly has not gone away. And for many people, it's gotten worse during the pandemic era. At the very least, this is going to lead to poor work-life balance, right? But at its worst, this can actually lead to some of these physical and emotional health issues that we were talking about before. The World Health Organization recently reported that each year, 750,000 people die from physical problems that are directly attributable to working long hours. So I think that means we all need to be working shorter work hours. I need to be telling myself that as well. Poor relationships and poor communication. This is something else that people have mentioned in the chat. Thank you all for joining this conversation, but these are among the top workplace stressors. And here's the thing about poor relationships. They tend to fester, right? And then they tend to cause other problems in the workplace as well, like poor collaboration and poor teamwork and a toxic workplace culture and maybe a growing sense of distrust. So poor relationships are definitely a problem. Perceived lack of control, like feeling like we don't have any control over what's going on at work, and maybe we have a sense that we're being micromanaged. This can be particularly demotivating and stressful. Lack of recognition. We can also become demotivated and burned out when we feel like no one is recognizing our hard work, because everyone likes to know that their contributions are valued. Lack of fairness. This is something else that I saw pop up. This can lead to burnout. This can include a lot of things. Unfair pay, imbalanced workloads that can create poor work-life balance, organizational changes that may impact some in a good way and others maybe in not so great way. Lack of support systems for dealing with burnout or compassion fatigue. And one final factor here that can affect people, particularly in caregiving industries like healthcare, for example, would be, and also I'd say animal care, would be disenfranchised grief. Feeling understood or maybe even punished in some way for expressing grief over some traumatic loss that you experience at work. You lose a patient, you lose a beloved animal, and you feel like for whatever reason, the workplace it could be hostile to that, or maybe there's a policy that makes you feel uncomfortable about expressing that grief. The final factor here of what workplace stressors can contribute to burnout would be a values mismatch. So the jobs that are most likely to cause burnout are those that put the workers at really high risk, or at odds, I should say, at odds with their own internal values. So one example of this that's happened during COVID among healthcare workers is something called moral injury. Some of you might have heard that term before. This is when caregivers are forced to witness traumatic events that kind of go against their own moral code. So it could be a healthcare worker who is not able to treat a patient, not because they don't want to, but simply because their hospital, their health system has run out of beds, run out of resources to care for that patient. So that is definitely that moral injury can definitely build up and cause both burnout and compassion fatigue. So here are all of the factors together. Have I missed anything? What other factors are not on this list that you can think of that might be contributing to burnout and or compassion fatigue? Any thoughts on that? Politics. Yeah. Yes, geography definitely can play a role in this. So as you can see, and some other comments might be popping up in the chat as well, as you can see, some of these underlying factors can get very complex, and we can all sort of have a different group of these things that can be underlying our sense of burnout and compassion fatigue, which is another reason why this is so complicated. But it's one of the reasons why I like to sort of sort out what the underlying sources are, so that we can all sort of identify. If we can identify sort of the underlying cause of some of the feelings that we have, some of the mental distress that we're experiencing, I feel like we have a better shot at actually being able to handle it, being able to address it in a healthy way, in a constructive way. So that being said, we've talked a lot about the sources of stress that can feed into burnout and compassion fatigue. Let's start talking about solutions now. We're going to start by talking about personal coping strategies, and then later on, we're going to be talking about organizational strategies. And let me just ask Thomas or Sharon, a quick question. Are we still planning to go to 7:30, I believe is your, no, 8:30 is your local time that we were scheduled to end? Will we still end on time?
I think it, Pam, as long as you are flexible to go a little bit longer because
I'm
we do
flexible.
start a bit later, I think that makes a lot of sense. We'd like to get
Okay.
as much of your wisdom and insight as possible.
Sure. Yeah. If no one minds, I'll plan to go a few minutes longer then. And thank you all for your flexibility on your end. I appreciate that. So let's start talking about personal coping strategies. The reason I wanted to ask that is I'm really hoping that we get a chance to do some group discussion here. What I'd like to do is divide us all into breakout rooms. We're going to be doing that in just a minute. But just to set that up, let's again look at this list of some of the personal circumstances that can lead to stress. Obviously, things on this list that we don't have personal control over, right? We don't have control over our history with stress. We don't have control over our genetics or our biology, but there are some portions of this list that we do have control over. We can make thoughtful, intentional decisions about some of these items. And so I suppose a good starting place for us talking about personal coping strategies is where do we, what can we do that we would have control over, right? As we break into breakout rooms, I'd like us to use this as a starting point. What are the things that we can do about these factors over which we have control? So I believe Sharon is going to break us into 3 breakout rooms, and I'd like breakout room number 1 to talk about burnout. So some personal coping strategies where you could address burnout. Breakout room number 2, we'll talk about secondary trauma. So how could you cope with secondary trauma? And breakout room number 3, we'll talk about compassion satisfaction. And the discussion questions that each group could use just as a launching point would be, what can you and I do about each one of these factors that's within our control? What might we want to start doing in our personal lives that would protect us from this factor, protect us from burnout, protect us from secondary trauma, protect us from compassion satisfaction? And a third discussion question, just as a launching point, would be, what might we want to stop doing? So again, what can we do that's within our control? What might we want to start doing? And what might we want to stop doing? So Sharon, are we going to break out into breakout rooms? Okay, awesome. I'm going to stay here in the main room if that's okay. But yeah, the rest of you, we're going to go for 6 minutes and then we'll see you back. You'll probably see an alert at the 5-minute mark too, that you're going to come back into the room at 6 minutes. So thanks
Sure.
all. If you haven't, each of the 3 breakout room groups, if your selected spokesperson has not unmuted, please unmute. And I would just love to hear your comments. From group number 1, you guys discussed burnout. What coping strategies did you come up with? I'd love to get your thoughts here. And please join in chat too, for those of you who, I mean, I don't care if you were part of this group breakout room or not. If you have thoughts on burnout, share in the chat. But yeah, so breakout room number 1, give us your ideas. Did you select a spokesperson, and has that person unmuted? Because I'm not hearing anything yet. Oh,
I just clicked that just about a minute ago. So
so Tina, if you were the
yeah.
spokesperson,
Let's try that again.
So I'm not the spokesperson, but I just wanted to let you know, I tried to post in the chat. We weren't assigned a group number, so we didn't know what group we were to discuss.
I'm so sorry. All right. Okay.
Can everyone hear me? I don't know that we assigned a group spokesperson, but I did jot down a handful of the things that we talked about in Burnout Room.
Please do, yeah.
Okay, so things that we can control are taking walks or getting more exercise, thinking about our diet, sleeping in, being able to
I love that one.
being able to say no, or feeling okay with saying no to some things, being okay if something falls through, and then also asking for help.
Oh man, I love those ideas. Any more thoughts people want to share in the chat? I'm all ears. I always learn from these audiences, so please do add some of your thoughts in chat. While you're doing that, I'm going to share with you some ideas that come from stress research. But you guys have already hit on a lot of these themes. So we always want to start with a sense of self-awareness, right? There are a lot of self-assessment tools, which is one of the reasons why we started out with the self-assessment today. We just sort of want to get a gauge of where we are personally with our stress and burnout. Another foundational element is self-care, which is, Julie, again, you guys touched on this theme already. Exercise, nutrition, rest, getting those annual health checks are so important. The brain is an organ. We tend to forget that, but it's an organ just like the heart is. So if we don't take care of it, we can't expect healthy emotions to come out of an organ that we're not actually taking care of very well. Again, this is another thing that you guys already touched on. Being able to say no and setting those boundaries is going to help us maintain that very important work-life balance. So we want to evaluate our workload and our priorities, course correct as we need to. Organizations, of course, also have their own role to play in helping us maintain a proper work-life balance. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Social connectedness and peer networks, these are really important. This turned out to be really important during COVID, especially with healthcare workers. There have actually been research studies that have showed that social support networks protected them against compassion fatigue and burnout. Thank you for adding those things into the chat, Julie. I really appreciate that. Addressing burnout factors at their source in the workplace, the things that are under our control, things like communication, conflict, relationships, workflow inefficiencies that we have say in. Of course, organizations are going to have their own role to play, but the things that are under our control, we try to address and resolve. Also, we need to be aware of how our own moods and thoughts are contributing to our stress. And again, I will use myself as an example. So not only do I tend toward pessimism, but I also tend toward perfectionism. And this is something that if you don't suffer with it, boy, does it cause a lot of stress, right? It adds a ton more pressure that we don't necessarily have to put onto ourselves. So just being aware of some of the thought patterns that we use and some of the coping mechanisms that we use for stress and how those things can sometimes work against us can be helpful. Thank you, Beth. The ability to prioritize decreases as stress increases. What do folks do to counter that? I would love to get your thoughts on that. I'll give you my personal take on that, which is, and I think that the people who just spoke to burnout already touched on this. When we are at a certain very high level of stress and burnout and our anxiety levels are through the roof, sometimes our brains are so, they're spinning so fast that we can't get ourselves out of that stress and burnout loop. We just cannot do that. And the way to get ourselves out of it is to allow the rest of the body to relax first. So when Julie said, let's take a walk, let's get out, let's take a break, let's sleep in. These are all ways of helping the body to dial down some of the tension and some of the, it's just the anxiety and stress that's built up in the rest of the body. If we allow the body to relax first, that somehow unlocks the things that yes, thank you, Leslie. This is also really important, deep breathing, which increases the oxygen delivery to the brain. That's also going to help. So all of these ways that you support the brain in trying to get back online so that we can all be thinking about and processing and how to prioritize. These are all things that can be helpful. All right, so secondary trauma. Was there a group that did discuss this? Anyone who spoke to this in your breakout rooms, I'd love to hear from you.
So we talked a lot about secondary trauma, and I think we really were, to sum it up, would be just recognition of everything, of feeling the time to grieve and taking that time to grieve, but also just the issues that were in front and center. And we talked about a lot of issues that maybe like seeing students dealing with, and I think just the mere acknowledgement of what's going on and taking that time to grieve it is what we found would be probably the best coping strategy we highlighted.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. I think just allowing ourselves this space to understand that we have just undergone a loss, to accept that, acknowledge it, and giving ourselves sort of the breathing room to experience that and process it emotionally, I think is really, really important. Any other thoughts on this? Anyone else want to chime in or add to the chat? So removing the sources of secondary trauma where possible. Yep, just giving ourselves that space. So Tina asks a really good question here. How do we find the space at a time where everything seems like a crisis? What are your thoughts on that? Schedule it, Leslie says, yeah. So you're probably all thinking, well, why don't you tell us? So I'll try. I think this is the trick. This is the challenge for all of us. I'd say that, yes, it does seem like we are in a spiral of crisis right now. We're in a loop or a spiral of crisis. So I suppose the best that we can do right now, there are two sort of spaces that I can think of. The first space are the many spaces that we have in our day that we can inject into our day. And I think other people have mentioned that, like Leslie mentioned, scheduling it, right? I think it's the many spaces that we intentionally put into our day, even if it's a 10, 15-minute walk to clear our head, or listening to NPR, listening to classical music in the car, something that you know is going to ramp down your emotions. This can be a mini break, a mini vacation that we can take to step out of that stress, right? That's one break that one space that I can think of. Another space that I can think of is the space that we have inside our social circles, inside our relationships. So when you get home and you are allowed to reconnect with the people that you love, that you care about, I think that that's another sort of emotional space that you can put yourself into that is going to recharge you, replenish you, not take something away from you. So whatever that circle is for you, if it's a friend group, if it's a partner, if it's a family member, those are all sort of emotional spaces, relational spaces you can put yourself in to try to disconnect from the crisis for a little while. So those are my thoughts for what they're worth. Let me share with you some thoughts on secondary trauma, but I think you guys, again, sort of hit it. Self-awareness is a great place to start. So and the other good news is what's helpful with burnout strategies is also very applicable here to secondary trauma. So we want to start with self-awareness, signs of trauma. Again, there are assessment tools that are available for you, and I will include those in the document that you'll get in the follow-up email after tonight's session. If you are exhibiting signs of secondary trauma, do consider getting treatment. There are several websites that will help you find a trauma specialist in your area. If you're hit with trauma, you want to be able to work from a place of emotional strength, right? So this is another reason why self-care and work-life balance are going to be very helpful in supporting that emotional health and provide that strength. Support groups for trauma survivors can also help you create connections with others who understand and empathize. I think empathy is something that someone mentioned in the chat already. Understanding and connecting with people who can come alongside you and understand exactly what you're going through can be very healing. And spiritual disciplines, spiritual communities can also provide solace and support in times of severe stress. Self-compassion. Many of you have probably heard that term. It's a hot topic in psychology right now. It basically means that we are extending to ourselves the same compassion and the same level of care that we would extend to another person that we really, really care about, right? So we treat ourselves in the same way that we would want to, or we treat ourselves in the same way that we treat other people. So there are three pieces of self-compassion. One is we treat ourselves with the same kindness, the same warmth, the same understanding that we would treat another person that we love. The second piece of it is rather than judging ourselves when we have negative feelings, we say, oh man, I'm so stressed out, I'm getting irritable, I'm getting angry, I'm getting impatient, and we tend to judge ourselves for those feelings. Instead of that, we try to accept the negative feelings that we're feeling and explore them in an open and curious and non-judgmental way. Like, okay, well, this is what I'm feeling right now. I wonder why I'm feeling that way, and I wonder what I can do about it. Just sort of accepting those emotions for what they are. And the third thing is remembering that we often share our suffering with others. So understanding that we're all sort of in the same boat, common humanity. This helps us not over-identify with our negative feelings right now, and helps to put them in larger perspective. So those are the pieces that come from research. I love the thoughts that are coming through in the chat as well. One question that's coming up is, how effective is journaling? Journaling is incredibly important because it allows us to sort of dig through and sort of take a journey through our own emotions to the point where we can start understanding what lies behind those emotions. What are the thought patterns that are leading us to feel certain ways? So I think that journaling is really helpful in trying to understand why we are where we are emotionally, and then maybe some thoughts about how we can get ourselves out. Do I have resources for support groups? I believe that in the document that I'm sending out, the last page of the document is a resource section. It may or may not have support groups. If the document itself doesn't have support groups, one of the links does. And thank you, Laura, for adding a link in the chat also. Really appreciate that. Okay, any thoughts on how to ramp up compassion satisfaction? We know we all want to decrease burnout and secondary trauma to deal with compassion fatigue, but how about increase in compassion satisfaction? What would we do there? Anybody, any group speak to this? Thank you, Sharon. I appreciate that. Well, throw your thoughts into chat. I'm sure we would all benefit from hearing some of your thoughts. Let me speak to it from a research perspective. Again, self-care is really important. We want to make sure that whatever self-care we're doing is strong enough to balance out the stress that we all undertake in our work, right? And the emotional impact of our work sometimes. So make sure that you are sleeping in once in a while. Make sure that you are having balanced meals. And it's perfectly fine to have a treat once in a while, where I'm not saying stay away from food. I'm just saying, you know, have a balanced diet. Make sure you're getting all your nutrients. Feel positively toward your colleagues. Make sure that you understand that we are all in the same boat. We're doing the best that we can to make it through some very challenging situations. Assume positive intent. No one is waking up in the morning and coming to work thinking, how can I make everyone feel as miserable as I possibly can? Even though sometimes it feels like that's what's going through their head, that's probably not what's going through their head. So assume positive intent. Assume that everyone is just doing their best and try to help out where you can. Feel positively about your impact and your contribution to the organization that you are with. Find your purpose, find your meaning again. If you have disconnected from that along the way, I can point you to some exercises for how to reconnect with your purpose. And identify what's important to you. What brings you joy and fulfillment in your job? And if at all possible, spend more time working on that. So those are some of the thoughts that come from the research world of how, yes, and Tina just said, focus on other areas of your life that bring you joy. So absolutely, Tina, I fully agree with that. All right, so in the final section of our, yes, volunteering is something that brings me joy too. So thank you for that thought. So we've talked about personal coping strategies. Now let's focus on what organizations, their role. We know that individual strategies are important, but they're definitely not the whole story. Research clearly shows that burnout is a shared responsibility between individuals, but also the workplaces that they're working in. So we know that organizations share this responsibility for resolving issues. And leaders are often really eager to help, but they may not necessarily know where to start. So we're going to I think what we'll do, rather than going into separate breakout rooms, I would love to get your thoughts on some initiatives that you have seen work really well at the organizations that you're working at. If you're working at a school, if you're working in the ministry, if you're working in a hospital or a veterinary clinic, or wherever it is that you're working, what organizational strategies has your workplace put into place over the past couple of years that has really supported people? While you're thinking and putting some thoughts into chat, I'd like to share with you just a very simple two-part strategy that I've used when I am advising or consulting organizations. Breaking it down into really simple pieces. In the first part, what you do is you ask the employees to pinpoint for you the workplace stresses that are feeding their sense of burnout and their sense of compassion fatigue. And then you strategize some ways that you're going to address those stressors. In the second part, what you do is you ask the employees what organizational initiatives would make them feel most supported, emotionally, physically, mentally, whatever. So I'm seeing some thoughts here in chat. Investing in employee resource groups. Absolutely, that's really important. I spoke with the employee resource group earlier. No, I guess it was last year. I keep forgetting it's 2022. That is for invisible disabilities. So people who are struggling with things, I don't know if you all know what invisible disabilities are, but they're things that we struggle with. It could be PTSD, for example, things that we don't necessarily share with other people, but things that are sort of impeding our ability to do our well. So employee resource groups that deal with specific issues. There could be one on burnout, there could be one on compassion fatigue. This can be really helpful. So yeah, weekly Zoom meetings with ministerial staff can be really helpful. Yes, the struggle is real, for sure, Tina, I agree. Another person is saying that they have weekly offer compassionate care. Yes. Education. Yes, these are all great ideas. Thank you all for your thoughts. Would anyone be willing to actually unmute and share some of your thoughts in a group discussion here of how you would provide support or how you would deal with specific stressors in your workplace?
I put mine in the chat, but I work, well, my partner is an attorney and I work for him sometimes, but we put raised bed vegetable gardens out front, and each one of the employees has their own garden, which they can take care of. And, you know, I end up taking care of much of it because it's my project, but if they don't have time, but it gives them an opportunity to get some outside time. We also have a little free library and a yoga studio at the office. So those are available to everyone, and kind of just trying to nurture that spiritual side of people a little bit more and giving them something to do that's different than sitting at a desk and, you know, collecting medical records and things like that all day long, which, you know, gets old and boring after a while. So we've also had a woman come in and do a nutrition course for us where she came once a week and then she would present some recipes that I would make for them at the office kitchen, and we would all share a meal together. So those things are always really successful at building some camaraderie and giving people a sense of purpose at work. We're also creating pollinator habitat there too. So everybody's got something to kind of rally around and talk about and feel proud of at work.
I love those thoughts. So there are several pieces of that I would sort of like to explore a little bit. So one thing that I'm noticing is your organization is not just relying on one strategy. You've got a lot of things going on. And I think that's important because different strategies are going to work for different people. Although some of the things that you're talking about are hitting a lot of different, they're ticking a lot of boxes, right? So your outside gardens, your vegetable beds, that's a great way for people to get exercise, to get fresh air, to get some vitamin D, sunshine, and also have a sense of community of building something. So that's awesome. Your resource library. What's in your resource library?
It's a little free library. So there's an organization called littlefreelibrary.org.
Mm-hmm.
And you can build a library, you can buy one from them, register it, and then you just keep books in it. And our office happens to be in an area where people don't have as much access to books as they do in some of the wealthier neighborhoods. I live in the greater Hartford area in Connecticut. So it's nice because I put books out there for adults and for children. People can bring their books and drop them off. In fact, my office is full of books that people in the neighborhood have dropped off to me. And, the next door neighbors will share books. And one of the next door neighbors came over to me one time and said, this library is transforming our neighborhood because I see people after hours and they bring their children and they hold them up and they get books out and they take pictures in front of it. And, so it's creating a sense of community on the street where we are. And so that's what that is. That's the Little Free Library. And I feel like all of these things just give people something to focus on and talk about when they're not at work. Like, wow, did you know I do this at work and I have this at work, and they can take time away from their desks, and we encourage it for them to go into the yoga studio and sit and be quiet, listen to music, just take some time away from their desks. So we also offer yoga to all of the clients who come in, and some take advantage of it and some don't. And, you have to kind of meet people where they are, but it is offered, during this stressful time, and before the pandemic, we were offering it too, but now more than ever, I think people just to have another option that maybe they hadn't thought of before is important. So we're trying to be a little different, and trying to create some opportunities for folks that maybe other people in our line of work aren't thinking about.
Yeah. Something else that you said that I loved was you said that you have those nutrition classes. You had that person come in and do a nutrition class, and you said that those sorts of talks, or maybe you were talking more broadly, but you said that this is building a sense of community and camaraderie in your office.
Oh, absolutely. We all enjoy each other very much. The pandemic has been stressful. Just all the courts have been closed and it's been hard to do business, but I feel like we've been able to manage it because we have this sense of community. We're a small office too. I can't imagine, if you're working at a hospital and, I know there are ways to create community there too in your small little area of your floor where you work or whatever, but, we only have 7 employees. So, it's wonderful. It could be bad with 7 employees because if there's one bad apple in the pot, it can affect everybody else. But we've been able to manage it and to give everybody, I think, a place where they feel like they're important and they're seen and they're appreciated.
Which goes back to that list of the top workplace stressors that feed burnout, one of which is lack of recognition and not feeling valued, right? So you're doing the opposite. You're saying, I see you, I hear you, I understand that this is tough and we're all in this together and let's support each other.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to hold people up and and to make them feel appreciated, and like what the work that they're doing is important and it's valuable to the organization. And, you know, we understand that where we are, but, you know, I know a lot of people work in places where that doesn't seem to be a priority. And I really feel for people like that. And I signed up for this program because I was feeling like, you know, I'm a little bit stressed like everybody, but now I'm feeling like, geez, I think I'm actually in a pretty good place.
That is the whole
Yep.
point. I think this is why Sharon and Thomas are doing things like this, is to provide some resources. Again, this is a multi-purpose seminar, right? You're getting information, at least I hope you're getting information that's helpful. This is a continuing ed experience for you, but it's also building community. It's also saying, we are all in this together. Let's share some resources and help each other out, right? So.
Absolutely. And I will just say this, I am a yoga teacher and I do my classes on Zoom and everybody is welcome. I taught one for the alumni when we first started this whole Zoom thing, and maybe some of you came, but I do all of my classes on Zoom, and so many people are coming from so many different places, and I teach gentle classes so everybody can do them. And it's another way to build community with each other, to have, even if we're in our little Zoom boxes, it doesn't matter. We can still see each other. We can talk to each other. We joke around at the beginning of class and we just have this nice little group. Even if you don't participate, you can still listen. And so anyway, I mean, I didn't mean to plug or anything like that, but anybody is welcome to do those classes. And I'm happy to, I'll just put my website in the chat if anybody would like to follow up. I actually have several of my classmates, I'm class of 1986, who come now. And I had one this morning. It's like, I see more of her now than I did when we were walking around campus, you know?
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
Well, that's been a blessing that Zoom has given us, is the ability to have a community that's outside of our local communities. We can connect through Zoom, which is great. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your thoughts, everybody. Let me just speak to some of the sort of broad strokes recommendations that I give people. I tell organizations when they're trying to deal with workplace stressors that are hitting their people, I try to get them to, thank you for putting that link in the chat. So I try to tell organizations to list out some of the top sources of stress for their employees. It could be excessive workload. It could be staffing shortages. I think some people mentioned that in the chat. It could be some relationship issues, conflicts at work. It could be a lack of recognition. It could be a lack of control. So I asked them to try to list some of these things out and then ask themselves again, starting with the question of what pieces of this do we have control over? That would be one important question, is what can we do something about right now? Another question that I ask organizations to ask themselves when they're trying to grapple with these issues is, what could we do something about that is going to create the greatest lift of morale for our organization? What would boost morale if we dealt with the lack of recognition? Would that really move the needle for some people who are burned out in our organization? So that's another thing. What would make the greatest impact? So again, these are some of the questions that I ask organizations to ask themselves as they are looking or thinking about some of these workplace stressors. And then what you want to do as an organization is you want to brainstorm some ideas. What can we do about these things that's within our control? What could we do that would be really helpful for our people? What would work the fastest and give some quick wins for our people? What would give them the greatest impact? And what is within your control for your teams right now? Then once you have your list of ideas, you want to break that down and create some actionable goals from it. So to narrow down to a list of, a few actionable goals, maybe what you want to do is you want to ask yourself, how would each one of these ideas align with the mission or the core values of the organization? or what aligns with our strategic plan, or what would give the greatest impact to our financial bottom line, or what would give the greatest impact to employee morale. Whatever criteria makes the most sense for your organization, you would want to use that criteria to narrow down to a list of just a few actionable goals to work on as a start. Doesn't mean you're not going to eventually work on all of your ideas, but you would want to start with a few, get those done, and then start with a few more and get those done, right? Then what you want to do is you want to develop a realistic plan for achieving those goals. So you want to ask yourself a few more questions. First of all, who at the organization is going to take charge of doing this particular thing? Who has the authority and responsibility for this goal? In other words, what authority might be, what authority might we need to give people that they don't already have to accomplish this goal? What backing might they need from higher up people, administrators, C-suite people, or stakeholders in the organization? What's our time frame? When is our goal deadline? And what milestones might we need to put into place to accomplish this thing? What resources do we need to get this thing done, whatever it is we're planning to do? Do we need to talk about budget, to talk about personnel, training, bringing in experts or consultants? What time do we need to build into our organization for people to be able to accomplish this thing? How will space be carved out in resources to make room for these goals? Then you might want to think about what challenges do you foresee and accomplish this thing, and how are you going to challenges? And what needs to be communicated to the rest of the organization about these goals? How and when are you going to send these messages? So these are just all the pieces. When you're trying to create a strategic plan for addressing a specific workplace stressor, you just want to think about some of these sort of pieces of it. Now let's talk about support. Let's talk briefly about how to give employees the support that they need. Again, I'm going to speak to a very high level. I'm really glad to hear that some of your organizations are actually putting some well-being practices already into place, but I'm going to give you a few tips that come from a team, Paul and Nadine Sinclair. They're the leaders of an organization called Mind Matters. And what I love about them is they use neuroscience and psychology to try to help organizations develop these support systems. And they have come up with what they call the 5 pillars of mental well-being programs. So the first thing that you want to do when you're trying to support your employees and their mental well-being is you want to make a strong business case for well-being. And the way you do this is you tie employee well-being to the company's bottom line. You want to show leadership how worker productivity is being negatively impacted by poor mental health, and if you turn that around, how that will impact financial performance and shareholder returns for your organization. If you do that, then you go a long way in establishing the second pillar, which is gaining leadership support. And leadership support is going to be vital in actually having employees participate in whatever well-being programs you are offering, right? So you can have a lot of well-being programs at your organization, but if no one participates, it's not going to do any good, and you're going to have a very poor return on investment. Leadership plays a vitally important role in turning that around. High participation rates can pay off big time. So one large company, Cigna, they recently reported that when their employee engagement rates grew by not a lot, it was relatively high. It was 75% in their well-being programs, but they grew it from 75% to 92%. And the return on investment for those well-being programs increased by, it increased 11-fold for that relatively minor jump. So high participation rates can make a huge difference. The next thing that you want to do is you want to change the culture of your workplace. And again, I think this is something that a lot of you have already spoken to. It starts with a firm commitment and modeling by leadership. So a culture of well-being is going to support the employees. It's also going to address stigma, right? So there's another comment here in chat. You want to turn around and shut down any stigma against talking about mental health in the organization. And the other thing that the culture needs to do is it needs to address the key factors that we just talked about. If you have issues in your workplace, like overwork, poor work-life balance, poor relationships, poor communication, lack of control, lack of trust, these things need to be addressed specifically by leadership and turned around. 4, what you want to do is you want to use a comprehensive set of metrics to design, monitor, and evaluate your program effectiveness. So here's some metrics to think about at your organizations. Absenteeism, presenteeism, which remember is where people are there but they're checked out mentally. Disability claims that your organization has related to mental health issues. Employee turnover, productivity, ability to attract and retain talent, job satisfaction, employee morale, and engagement rates. And those are just a few of the metrics you could use. There are some organizations that use 90 or more metrics to determine how effective their wellness programs are. So we've already talked about some ways to build personal resilience, with these personal coping strategies. I'm just going to add 2 things here to the mix here. First of all, your workplace culture needs to align with any efforts that individuals are making, not work against it. So again, this speaks to a comment that I see in chat where if there's mental health stigma in the workplace, that's going to be working against people's ability to try to improve their mental health, right? So you want to address mental health issues. The second point that I'd make about building personal resilience is that well-being programs will be most effective if they are proactive instead of being reactive. So think back at the beginning of the session where we saw that spectrum of stress symptoms, going from the very mild stress symptoms that we saw in yellow, then progressing through orange and then red to the very severe symptoms. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to wait until all your employees already in the red zone with severe stress symptoms before you decide you're going to provide support. Well-being programs are going to be a lot more effective, and they're also, financially speaking, going to have a greater return on investment if they help people before the stress levels ever reach that critical point. And just to drive that point home, again, this data comes from the Mind Matters organization, and it shows the difference between proactive versus reactive interventions. So at the bottom, you see more reactive interventions, and these things are not bad. They're great things to do. If you've just undergone a crisis, of course, you're going to do things like provide counseling sessions with a mental health professional and so on. And that gives a respectable return on investment, right? For every $1 you invest as an organization, you're probably going to get $3 back, which is great. That's great. But the ROI is going to improve if you, rather than just be reactive, you start being proactive. So in the middle, you see items like including mental health workshops and coaching service. And you do that before a crisis even starts. So the ROI starts to climb as you provide more proactive services. And even better are preemptive measures. You see those up at the top. And these are things like raising awareness by providing themed seminars. Some of you are already doing workshops in your workplace, which is awesome. Doing trainings and transforming workplace culture, promote well-being, and actually encourage people to deal with mental health issues rather than having this stigma attached to mental health. So the ROI here is double that of just reactive interventions alone. So we have talked through some of the sources of workplace stress, the things that we do personally, perhaps, the ways that our workplace culture may be feeding into our sense of burnout and our sense of compassion fatigue. And then what I wanted to do at the end is really talk specifically about some strategies that we could use. We talked through several personal coping strategies that we can use for the 3 pieces of compassion fatigue, including the all-important burnout, which I know a lot of people are suffering from, but also secondary trauma and boosting our sense of passion satisfaction. And then I wanted to end by talking more globally. If there's any leaders in this group, any executives or team leaders, and you're wanting to boost employee morale right now, I wanted to leave you with some practical tips on how to do that. So I hope, armed with all of this information, you are ready to create the beginning of an action plan where you can identify some goals that you want to have for addressing burnout or compassion fatigue. You identify what you're going to need to achieve that goal, write it down somewhere, write down a resource list, identify people that are going to help you, reach out to those people, say, hey, I'm working on this particular project. Can you get a support team going? And then create a realistic time frame and checkpoints for progress. Put a deadline on your goal. If you want to do something like get more rest or eat better, put some specific actionable goals into place, put them on your calendar now and start working on them. So I've taken you about 10 minutes over our allotted time, so not too bad. I am so grateful for all of you being here this evening. If anyone has some final questions, comments, I'd love to hear them either in the chat or speak up. And just thank you so much for the opportunity to share this, this time with you.
Well, Pam, thank you so incredibly much for so many helpful tips and really helping us to think through ways to, as you said, identify some of these symptoms and how we're feeling, and then longer term create some real actionable goals. We greatly appreciate it. As Pam said, we're a little bit over time, so we want to be mindful of the rest of your evening, especially if your goal is to get a little more sleep. You might want to, spend a little more time in bed. I do want to let all of you know that we certainly have some more of these programs coming up. We've got one on making meetings matter. So thinking really strategically, if you're someone who runs meetings in your organization, or if you are someone who is sitting through those painful meetings, this may allow you to make some helpful tips to the person who is running those. We've got that coming up on the 22nd of February. We've also got another one coming up on time management as well. And as you may have seen, President Bolton will be leaving the College of Wooster and heading to Whitman College to assume the presidency there in July. So we will be having a little bit of a farewell tour for the president. We are going to be in Naples in just under 2 weeks. On January 31st. So if you're in the Naples area down in Florida, please join us for that. We'll also be in Cleveland, in New York, in DC, Chicago, and San Francisco, most likely in April and May. We're looking at outdoor places so that we can reduce any types of transmission of COVID. So be sure to keep an eye on that. And we will be sending out this video as well as some of those materials that Pam mentioned probably tomorrow or by Monday at the latest. Sharon will get those out to all of you. We really appreciate you being here. Pam, thank you so much. It was a pleasure and incredibly informative. We appreciate your time this evening. And we look forward to seeing all of you either in person in one of our regions or at Alumni Weekend, June 9th through the 12th, or at our next virtual panel that we will have. So enjoy the rest of your evening. Please take care and be safe. And as always, go Scots.